So good morning, everybody, and thank you so much to PrimeKey for inviting me along today to talk to you at Tech Days. I'm really sorry not to be with you in person this year. Hopefully that will be different next year and I'll be able to meet many of you then. But I hope that this morning we'll have a good opportunity to talk together to discuss open sources all around us. I think we're going to wait for the end for questions, but please feel free to ask. My name is Amanda Brock, as they've said, and I am CEO of OpenUK. Now, OpenUK is an industry body, an advocacy organisation in the UK advocating for open technology. That's the three opens: open source software, open hardware, and open data. And we're probably the first organisation anywhere in the world to do that. Our vision is to develop and sustain UK leadership in open technology. And we do that through three pillars. And those pillars are community, legal and policy, and learning. And we possibly, with Brexit, we're more focused than many quickly on creating a loud, visible community locally, geographically locally. We have a huge number of people in the UK working in open technology, but many of them don't know each other. I had the experience myself of discovering one of my neighbours is actually one of my colleagues, something that happens to people frequently, because we work on international collaborations, international projects, and the geographical focus hasn't been one that's been particularly emphasised in the past. We build this community to create this loud and visible voice through a variety of different means, including things like blog posts, podcasts, and events. And we currently have an awards ongoing. We have a short list of 17 candidates for 6 awards, and we'll be announcing the winners of that on the 20th of October. Our second vertical, our second pillar is legal and policy, using that loud community, that visible community to influence legal and policy to make sure that the UK is a great place to do open source. That was an easy area for us because in the UK, we happen to have a number of very established people with great reputations around legal and policy for open. Now, what we realised was that although we have this great older community, we are an older established community. And there weren't people coming up behind us. So we've also created a future leaders group, a group for younger lawyers and policy people to get involved and engaged and to learn about open and ensure that we have a future group who will manage this as time passes. And what they're currently working on is a review of UK procurement processes and terms in UK government. We have also worked with the UK trade folk in their negotiations of the trade agreements as a consequence of Brexit, looking at source code provisions. And recently we've collaborated with the Commission's OSCE on their review of open source across Europe, in the UK in particular, from our perspective. And our third pillar is learning and education. And that's one that's really important to me and close to my heart. We started this year with a competition. We intended to bring kids to London to Red Hat's Innovation Labs, where they would meet the singer Imogen Heap, double Grammy award-winning singer and technologist Imogen Heap, who inspired the Mini Moo glove, the software glove you can see here for kids. That glove has actually been open sourced as part of our process, but unfortunately, we've not been able to do what we planned. And we'd planned to bring kids to London with Red Hat so that they could work with Imogen in the Red Hat Innovation Labs. Instead, what we've done is create a kids course. We've repurposed the funding we had for travel, and we've created 10 animated lessons that formed a kids course. We've added 10 e-zines to those and packaged it up as an open kids camp. So those 10 lessons teach kids both digital skills and something about open source. That ran via our website and YouTube through the summer, through August, but it's Creative Commons and it's something that's available for anyone to use. So if you'd like to have your own kids, or you're perhaps a community leader working with kids, you're very welcome to take that course. You will need a glove kit. I think they're about €40 online, and you can learn with your kids about open source there. The first episode was very kindly narrated by Imogen Heap for us. And it's already award-winning in that we have been a phase 1 winner of the GNOME Community Challenge. But that was a forerunner for us. Setting that course and competition up was to create visibility and to allow us to take the next steps, which will be to build a certification for kids, for high school kids, to have something like a GCSE in open source, and also an apprenticeship scheme for kids to go straight from school into working in open. Finally, with regards to OpenUK, we have Ditto Developing the Open, which is a government-funded EOBS project, creating EOBS systems for hospitals that can be used on an open healthcare basis. Like many people in Open, I have a number of jobs. I don't just work with OpenUK. Very close to my heart is Open Invention Network, and I've worked in an advocacy capacity for OIN for about 7 years. Prior to that, when I was in Canonical, I was on OIN's board. And OIN creates the biggest defensive IP community in the world. We have over 3,300 today members, and members join for free. They all sign up to the same license. And what they do is join a patent pool. They each commit to license their patents to the extent they read on the Linux system definition. 3,000 packages. Linux is a bit of a misnomer. It's an open source package list. It includes things today like Apache, Cassandra, Kafka, Spark, Hadoop, and we're currently adding the Hyperledger packages to that. So being part of OIN is part of the good housekeeping of open source. If you're a user, and as I've mentioned, it's zero cost. But you can sign up on the OIN website for free in about 10 minutes. I also sit in a number of advisory boards. OASIS is an open standards body. I sit on their Open Projects Council, and I chair the UN's open source and IP advisory group for their innovation labs. I do some commercial advisory work, and I sit on the advisory board of the talent platform Beamery. I'm also the editor of a book coming out next year, and I just want to pause for a moment to mention that to you. Free and open source law, policy and practice will be available from spring next year. It has more than 20 contributors from some of the best in the world in this area. And I'm really proud to say that the Veitch Foundation have provided funding, which allow our OUP distributed book to be available as open access books, so you'll be able to freely download that information and guidance from a variety of top experts. And my last job, I suppose, is things like today. Normally I would be traveling the world. Today I'm traveling my kitchen, speaking to you about open source. So how did a nice girl like me end up in a space like this? Well, at the beginning of 2008, I joined an open source company, one of the biggest in Europe, Canonical. And Canonical is the open source sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system. It was set up by a chap called Mark Shuttleworth, who I personally view as a visionary in the open source space. And he set up Canonical in a support model. So Canonical focused on the desktop and the server environment back in 2008 and generated revenue in implementation, augmentation, support, and maintenance of open source. If you haven't heard of Canonical, you will definitely have heard of Red Hat. Red Hat works on a slightly different model where Red Hat has a subscription. What that means is, unlike Canonical, where Mark has said that Ubuntu is open source, it's free, and it will always be free, to use Red Hat Enterprise Edition, you have to subscribe and pay a subscription fee, which gives you a bundled package of service and software. Now, what I haven't mentioned is what is open source. Open source is definitely not a business model. You've seen that Canonical and Red Hat have business models, but open source is something totally different. I repeat, it is not a business model. What open source is a methodology for development or a way of licensing. If you want to call something open source, it has to be an OSI approved license, and it has to meet the OSD, the open source definition. That's a really important thing to remember, and it's something that we'll come back to through my talk. Now, when I left Canonical, I didn't know what to do, and I wanted to stay in open source. I was quite early stage. It was the beginning of 2013. And I found myself going into a law firm where I could do nothing but advise startups and young companies on open source. Now, Mark Shuttleworth would say that when you look at software, you can't look at software in the future and digitization using the lens of the past. In the past, software sat in the hands of the few. Going forward, software sits in the hands of the many. Much of it is open source, and there are many, many owners and holders of that software. In the podcast that he discussed this, the Open Source Underdogs podcast, and we'll come to Open Source Underdogs a few times in this talk. I highly recommend their podcasts if you're looking at open source and business models. He also talks about how difficult that can be. And he describes it as something that can be emotionally and financially draining. As I moved to advising a number of new organizations looking at their business models around open source, I came up with a what if theory. And what I would explain to these young founders who came to me wanting to build open source businesses was what if. So if you build software and it's open source, what if someone else uses it? Well, mostly they didn't mind because that's the nature of open source. What if somebody else uses it and makes money? And you could see them start to think, not sure about that in many cases. Some of them, of course, understood. And then the final what if somebody else takes your software and makes a lot of money out of it and you make nothing? Or even worse, you lose money. Many of those young entrepreneurs didn't come back to me. Some did, but many didn't. And they'd at least done something right. They'd thought through their business model before they decided that their organization was going to open source their software. And what we've seen is ongoing development of software as we go through digital transformation. For many who were dragging their heels, the pandemic has been the final stage of forcing that digital transformation. And today, all companies are digital. They either create, distribute, or have consumed their products using software. Inevitably, they may not realize that they've become software companies, and many, many more don't realize that they've become open source companies. But those are both realizations that they're going to have in a relatively short space of time. And as they come to that, they'll understand that we're now living in an age of collaboration. And that collaboration is nowhere more obvious than in cloud computing. So back in 2012, I was on the OpenStack drafting committee. Canonical was one of the founders of OpenStack, a fundamental part of cloud technology. And as we saw a shift, we moved away in Canonical from just being in the desktop and server space into the cloud space. There's a chap, Simon Wardley, who was our cloud director. If you haven't heard Simon speak, I highly recommend him. He's one of the best speakers in the world on open source. And Simon and our team, our collaboration internally, moved Canonical into a space where Red Hat had been the dominant player in cloud. And overnight, we had over 70% of the cloud market. Now, I've explained Canonical was on a support model for its open source. And when you move to platform, when you move to cloud, you're taking a service. You're not necessarily using the open source software in the same way or the software in the same way, which means that it's harder to sell maintenance and support and the other add-ons, the other tools of a support model. So for Canonical, although we saw this shift in uptake, we didn't see the same necessarily shift in revenue. And that's something that is really important to understand about the platform economy, and it's had a lot to do with where open source has gone in that. Initially, we looked, when we were talking about open source, in terms of total cost of ownership. And we looked at total cost of ownership, which would be a zero license software package. But of course, you had other costs and implementation, integration, and the like. Today, that isn't necessarily the right model in the platform economy. And gradually, we're seeing the economics of open source move towards total cost to enterprise. What that it means exactly is something that's still being established. Is it the cost of building the software and building the infrastructure that the cloud and platform sit on? Or is it the actual financial benefit to business? Something that hopefully I'll be able to talk to you more about by next year. And it's not just OpenStack where we saw Canonical and Red Hat collaborate. And that's the beauty of open source. It's the beauty of building this foundational software. We have collaboration low down in the stack and differentiation further up. We're able to collaborate, to have many eyes making better software, to reduce costs, something that's natural to a digital economy, and we're going to see more and more companies do over the next few years. But we were able to collaborate in that way, despite competing day in, day out, tooth and nail in the cloud environment. And it wasn't just Red Hat and Canonical. We saw the same with ARM and Intel, with Dell and HP, who were all part of this. As time's gone by, this has expanded, and it's expanded beyond OpenStack. We see here the Linux Foundation CNCF environment, and there's over 370 cards in this environment, in this landscape, most of which are open source that create the whole infrastructure of public cloud. But look at the money involved. Market capitalization in the trillions, funding in the billions. It's very easy to pick a handful of those companies. I've put half a dozen logos here. and to see how those have developed. Now, these are the infrastructure that the cloud and platforms, at least public cloud, is built on. And for those companies in a Git environment, in a world where software is shared via GitLab, GitHub, and other Git repos, we see it being very easy for a company to gain traction and establish itself in the market quickly by being an open source, or by having its software open source as a company. And you'll recognize many of these names. I didn't even put Kubernetes' name against it because it's become like Linux. It's something that everybody knows. It's huge. But what we've also seen as time has passed and companies have taken advantage of this is that some companies have not followed my canonical or post-canonical what-if advice. They've gone into this and they've seen the advantages of open source, but they haven't thought through the fact that open source is not a business model. And we've seen what I've called for the last few years the open core wars. Companies often becoming something called open core, where they start thinking they're going to be an open source organization, and then they pull back and they create some of their software as proprietary on a go forward basis. We've also seen open source companies in disputes with some of the big cloud providers. Elasticsearch is a great example of that, where Elastic had their software forked by Amazon, something that's absolutely legitimate for Amazon to do under an open source license, although Elastic are in litigation with Amazon over trademarks, which is a slightly different scenario. We've also seen companies like Redis Lab find what they think are creative ways of managing that move to proprietary software or becoming open core and mixed. This is the Commons Clause from the Commons Clause website, something that Redis Labs had created. I want to be absolutely clear, this is not open source. Their website says it is best not to call Commons Clause software open source software. I don't agree with that. If you add the Commons Clause, you're making existing open source license restricted through a field of use. You're modifying that license. It is no longer open source. It is not open source, and it cannot be called open source. And this is the kind of response we've seen from companies where their business model hasn't been thought through and they've not been able to sustain their goal or desire to become an open source company. As Mark Shuttleworth said in his Open Source Underdogs podcast, creating open source software benefits your competitors through your own innovation. You're facilitating competition through your innovation. He also described it as financially and emotionally draining at points. And that's something these companies and the open core wars have seen. Almost surprisingly to me, this is something that's become mainstream. But then it's not surprising when we look at the scale of open source today, how it underlies the internet and the cloud. And in 2018, I think, 2019 rather, towards Christmas, we saw AWS being discussed in the New York Times for a practice called strip mining. This practice where they and others would take open source software like Elastic and they would fork or use it without contributing back to that particular company. Now, AWS were understandably quick to respond. We had Andy Gutman write this blog, somebody who's very respected in the open source community, to clarify and confirm that what they were doing technically is legal under open source licensing. Back to my what ifs. Going back to the Open Source Underdogs podcast, you see James Waters at Pivotal and Shannon Williams discuss how it is possible to be an open source company and be profitable. And I would recommend these two podcasts in particular. When you listen to James, I picked his before Pivotal was sold to VMware, but before Rancher was sold to SUSE, which has happened this year. And what we're seeing is some companies definitely becoming successful in that cloud environment and working out ways to generate revenue. We're also seeing some of the big cloud companies definitely working with open source and trying to make this work. Google in 2018 invited a number of companies to their offices and created an infrastructure where they now bundle and package open source software into a paid for service and share revenue and are collaborative with the open source companies. That benevolence is something that might be difficult to scale, and it's something that we may not want to see open source rely on. And we may now have to look at pushing to have this service layer, the layer where this software creates revenue and where lock-in is created or lock-out is created, lock-in for customers, lock-out for vendors. being something in the cloud environment that's opened up. And that's another ongoing discussion you're going to see over the next year or two. But why does this matter? Well, it's important that we ensure the longevity of open source. It's important that we create future innovation and that we allow open source to thrive so that we see things like in the internet and the cloud and platforms continue because they're built on open source, but also so that we see new innovation. But someone like Linus or me, well, we would say that. Don't take our word for it. Let's look at Microsoft. Microsoft is a company whose CEO 10 years ago, Steve Ballmer, described open source as a cancer. Yet today, Satya Nadella asked to be judged on Microsoft's actions of today and the future. It's a company that's been on a journey, a 10-year journey, and one that if you have 13 minutes, I recommend Steve Wally's keynote at the Linux Foundation in 2018. And Microsoft had just joined Open Invention Network, bringing their massive patent pool into it. Another reason to join and get your free license. But what Steve was really talking about was that journey. And he explained that there are 3 reasons Microsoft has been on that journey. And those 3 reasons are the same reasons that any company going through a digital transformation should learn from Microsoft and follow that same journey. Firstly, 10 years ago, open source wasn't something customers asked for, and today they all do. Secondly, cloud. Microsoft's got this little product called Azure that you might have heard of. And Azure, of course, is built on the cloud and it's built on open source infrastructure. For it to be successful, as with all cloud, it has all platforms it has to engage with and collaborate and contribute to open source. And thirdly, developers. As we move forward, all software companies and all companies are software companies need to recruit developers, particularly younger developers who were born after 1989 when the Linux kernel was created. They've grown up with this and they expect, the best developers expect to work in a collaborative, open way. Even if that's inner sourcing, they expect to be able within companies to use open source methodologies and practices. And we want to make sure whether you're in security or any other area of software that we don't have instances where the maintainers are not paid, where maintenance falls away for open source that's critical. We don't want to see more heartbleed instances. So as I leave you, I'd like to leave you with 2 or 3 thoughts. We're in an economy, a digital economy, where all companies are becoming software companies, all companies are coding, and you inevitably will all become open source companies, like it or not. You will all be consumers or distributors of open source. And I would encourage you, as you code, to think about open source, to collaborate in our communities properly, and to make sure that you're paying your way. Secondly, I would encourage you to collaborate, to join open source communities. Okay, I understand that many companies want to start with inner sourcing and will build up to this, but dip your toe in the water and learn to be part of open source projects and collaborate. And if you're uncertain, go to the experts, find companies like PrimeKey, companies that understand open source who will help to shape and guide your policies and your practices. And with that, I'm going to leave you, but I hope that you'll have some questions for me.
Great presentation. Let's check if Amanda is able to join us live. Hello, Amanda, can you hear us?
Hello there. Yes,
Great.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you for joining us. Great presentation. We really loved it. I think it's going to be a really great use for both large enterprises, but also for the startups. Maybe some of them can also reach to Amanda and ask for advice. So, Thomas, what kind of questions have you for Amanda?
Yes, I certainly enjoyed your talk extremely much, Amanda. So it's very interesting talking about the evolution of open source and business models and how things evolve over time. And the journey certainly doesn't stop here. So we had one question to start with, that Pierre doesn't understand really in what sense does Brexit affect the use of open source in the UK, do you think?
Oh, interesting. That is a good question. Well done. Brexit impacts us as technically we left the EU in January, 31st January. And what that means is that already on European legislation, we are a rest of world. So on consultations that are going forward, the UK is not included in Europe. Now, what we're seeing happening in Europe is some really fantastic work where the Commission are about to issue their open source policy in the next couple of months, had a very large workshop last year looking at hardware and software. And then they have also commissioned a report which will be delivered in January. We saw back in April, during lockdown, we saw the Parliament create a rule which required all public institutions in Europe to use Open First. Now, we've had a similar situation in the UK for a long time, for almost 10 years. The difference is that this new piece of legislation, this new rule in Europe, requires an audit annually, and actually to demonstrate where you've not used open source and why, and financially explain that. Now, this sudden traction in Europe and this move forward in Europe has been a long time coming, and it's something we've been watching. The concern is that the Europeans will continue down this great path and that the UK will be left behind, that we won't be engaging from a public sector perspective in the same way. We're also concerned about the general sense for the community that we'll feel cut off. And we wanted to make sure that people have those geographical connections, those grassroots connections in the UK, as well as still collaborating globally. And by pulling ourselves together to create a really strong voice in the UK, we hope will be easy to find and will be very visible and able to interact and continue our international projects.
Great. We have one more question. Has there been any positive outcome from the strip mining concerns? Very interesting question.
Yeah, well, I think there's a positive in everything, right? You can always find a positive. For me, the positive in the strip mining activity is that it's drawing attention to a situation that impacts startups, whether they're open source or not. There is now a lot of discussion going on around the service layer, and that service layer in the cloud environment is where the cloud companies which own the environment can lock vendors in. So if they don't open up those services to competition, it means that the customers who've come to them find it difficult to move. It also removes the opportunity for leading companies to offer alternative services. So the strip mining activities are drawing a light on those activities. They're making people think about it and causing calls for those to be opened up. And I think there's a second benefit, which is the learning that anybody setting up an open source based company is now having. It's really focused us on open core, on how you commercialize open source, how we move from the old models that worked in a non-platform economy in terms of finding the commercialization so that we can continue to fund the work these open companies do. So yeah, I think there are some positives.
So I have a quick yes or no question. No, we have one more.
Okay.
Would you consider community edition of a commercial product as an open source product?
It is definitely an open source product. Whether it's a commercial product is a different question. So I think anything that is released in the package form and has adopters is probably a product. So it really comes back to your definition. It's potentially not a commercialized product, though. I think I probably quoted in that talk one of the founders of HashiCorp. I often do when I'm talking about this area, where they said they didn't have a commercial model because they never ever expected this to become something that was more than a community edition, and HashiCorp sort of morphed and grew. And I think that's the one time that you find a good excuse for not having thought your commercial model through.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for a great presentation. And everybody, if you have additional questions, don't be shy. Post it in the chat or send a direct message to Amanda. Thank you again. In our hearts, UK is still Europe. And speaking about Europe...
Thank you. Good to hear.
And you are in our hearts. Thank you for all great contributions for the open source community, Amanda.